Hey, this is Jürgen Rasmussen. In this video, I'm going to be delving into the awakening industrial complex, how meditation teachers and awakening coaches are peddling psychologically flawed and outdated ideas that do a lot of harm for a lot of people. Before we get into that, just a little bit about my background and motivation for doing this particular video. I've been meditating for the last 35 years. I do help people to see through the self-illusion. And I've also spent the last 28 years as a psychotherapist and as a hypnotherapist. So I spend my days seeing people who depress and who anxietize and who struggle with chronic pain and conflicts and so on and so forth. So I've spent a lot of time working with people who meditate, and I've seen so often how these outdated psychological concepts that way too many meditation teachers promote do a lot of harm. So let's get into this. The first one is way too many meditation teachers and awakening coaches seem stuck in old psychodynamic theories. Theories such as repression and repressed memories. Listen to many of these teachers, and they will talk about how during the awakening process, all these repressed emotions and repressed memories may come up to the surface, and that is to be expected. Here's the problem. There's pretty much zero evidence that what we call repression is even a thing. So about 20 years ago, the psychologist Harrison Pope challenged a bunch of scholars to go through the literature and to see if they could find any references to the concept of repression outside of recent Western culture, and they couldn't. When they look, they can find a lot of references for what we call schizophrenia and psychopathy from cross cultures and different time periods, but they find nothing when it comes to the concept of repression before Sigmund Freud. So you had Pierre Janet, who spoke about dissociated memories back in 1889, and then you had Sigmund Freud with his seduction theory, where he laid forth this model or theory about how the mind will repress traumatic memories to such an extent that we don't even consciously know that they occurred, and that these memories can be called forth later in therapy. Now, it's worth noticing that Freud himself actually retracted that idea after a couple of years. But this idea lives on in meditation circles. So here's a couple of things to know. A, the memory science does not at all support the notion of repression. That's the first thing to know. So when memory scientists have studied what we can call traumatic events, the memory science very strongly points in the opposite direction. And that is that when we have experiences that we find very personally meaningful and where a lot of emotion is activated, we tend to remember it more clearly and more vividly over time. This is solidly where the memory research is pointing. Now, when it comes to psychological research, there's really nothing there either to support this whole idea of repression. Now, let's be clear on our terms here. There's a difference between suppression and repression. So suppression is when someone consciously tries to not think about something, or they try to distract themselves from certain thoughts and feelings. That's a conscious mechanism. Repression is an unconscious mechanism where the theory, again, is that we may experience something and the unconscious mind represses it and stores it so that we don't even consciously know that it happened, and that this memory is lurking around, repressed in the unconscious mind, and can be recalled later. Again, there's really no basis for this. Bessel van der Kolk, the author of When the Body Keeps the Score, who's one of the main proponents for repression these days. And his book, The Body Keeps the Score, is quoted and cited by so many meditation teachers. Do you know what Bessel van der Kolk quotes as the best research to support the notion of repression, the best study? Well, it's the report of Linda Meyer Williams. So between 1973 and 1975, she interviewed a bunch of people through the National Institute of Health who had been to the ER and reported sexual abuse. And then 17 years later, she was able to track down many of these folks, and she interviewed 129 of them. And she didn't ask them specifically or tell them specifically why she was interviewing them, but she asked them to kind of tell what they were doing at the ER back then. And 38% of them did not then report sexual abuse. By Linda Meyer Williams and people like Bessel van der Kolk and trauma activists, this has been promoted as solid evidence of repression being a thing. But is it? Let's look at this carefully. So among those 38% who did not report the specific incident of sexual abuse, 68% of them reported other incidents of sexual abuse. So the thing is that if someone has, let's say, been sexually abused once, they're likely to remember it, right? But if someone's been sexually abused throughout their childhood, for example, they may not remember all the events. This isn't proof of repression. It's just that if you have a lot of experiences of something, you're likely to blend memories together and to just forget some of them, right? Now, 11% of these folks were younger than 3 years old. Quite a few were between the ages of 4 and 6 at the time. The youngest one was 10 months old. So we know from memory science that there's a phenomena called infantile amnesia, which is, people up until they are usually like 2.5, 3 to 4, that range, they don't store autobiographical memories in such a way that they can recall them as an adult. So this isn't proof of repression. This is just the brain not having developed yet in such a way that it can store autobiographical memories over time. And also kids younger than 2 years old, they haven't really developed even a sense of self yet. And it seems as if we need to develop a sense of self to be able to store autobiographical memory. So this is really important to consider. Something else too with this study, these were inner city kids and people who used the ER as their doctor, essentially. So what it doesn't open up for is the fact that people can forget things and remember them later. You may have had the experience of going to a high school reunion perhaps 25 years later, and someone starts telling stories, or you hear a particular song, or you see an old friend, and suddenly you start to remember stuff that you haven't thought about, in 25 years. You hadn't repressed it, you just hadn't thought about it, right? So, what this study does not have is a control group that looks at, hey, wait a minute, what about other people who went to the ER for and reported other events 17 years ago? How many of those will fail to report, specific memories? There's nothing like that. It's not good science. You have studies that show that, a year later, people fail to report a car accident, or 25% of people a year later having forgotten having been to the hospital a year previously. So again, according to Bessel van der Kolk, this is the strongest psychological research pointing in the direction of repression and repressed memories. So again, nothing to write home about. Couple of other things too. The science writer Mark Pendergrast spent years trying to, and he would attempt to talk to people like Judith Herman and Linda Meyer Williams and get access to people so that he could verify and collaborate cases of repressed memory. He failed to find a single case. The lawyer psychologist Christopher Barden, who was involved in shutting down the whole repressed memory therapy and multiple personality disorder clinics in the mid to late 90s, due to multiple multi-million dollar settlements, were able to spend years trying to track down and to verify cases of actual memory repression, and he failed to find a single case. I'll finally mention this. Mark Pendergrast, again, back in 1999, collaborated with 3 Holocaust historians, and they looked at thousands of cases and failed to find a single documented case of someone having repressed their experience of being at the Holocaust. So neither in the memory science nor in the psychological research is there really much evidence for this whole concept of repression. Consider that when you listen to all these awakening coaches and meditation teachers who talk about repressed memories and repressed emotions. You may wonder, well, what's the problem? Well, the problem is quite simply this, and that is that if people are being presented with this framework that the path towards awakening will produce, that they should expect all these repressed emotions and memories coming to the surface, people are suggestible. And if people believe in this, they can very likely begin to produce a lot of false memories and to generate a lot of emotions on the fly, which aren't repressed memories, but it's unnecessary psychological suffering. Consider Julia Shaw and Sean Porter's experiment back in 2016, where they were able to get 70% of college students to remember having committed a crime that they did not do. It was a very simple experiment. They contacted the parents of these students and had the parents provide information about a couple of events that had happened in their life. And then they made up this episode of having gotten into some sort of altercation with someone else and the police being called and to the scene and first the person was showed images and asked to describe these other events from the ages 11 to 14, and then they were asked about this other event, and of course initially everyone claimed to not remember, but they were told, well, your parents told us this, and here's the information, and just sit down every day and try to remember a bit more. And by the second time, most of them had begun to remember this. And by the third time, 70% had memories of committing a crime they had not committed, and they had added their own details as well. And quite a few were distraught. They had painful negative emotions around this whole thing, which never happened. So for medical students, there's something which is called medical school disease. It's a very interesting phenomenon where a lot of medical students, when they study various diseases and they begin to feel into their own body, and they begin to imagine things, and they begin to look for symptoms, quite a few of them begin to develop symptoms and develop distress and the belief that they have these diseases. Again, completely unnecessary suffering. And some, of course, also develop some of these diseases as well. So what this can easily do too, and I've seen this so many times in my practice, people who, had you talked to them when they were, let's say, 16 years old and said, how was your childhood? How was your parents? How was your brother? They might have said, mostly good, loving parents, supportive, good childhood. And then you speak to them in their late 20s, and they might have adopted, some radical feminist ideology, and they might be seeing a psychotherapist where they're looking for repressed memories and trauma and stuff like that. And now, due to these old beliefs, they are recalling a horrible childhood where they were repressed, and where they begin to have all these emotions that correspond with them being oppressed and being a victim, and this being presented as repressed memories that were lifted. They're not repressed memories that are lifted. It's the mind in the moment reconstructing what it thinks happened based upon their current framework. So this is so important to be aware of. There's another really horrible idea here too, which is related to these old psychodynamics ideas of repression and Bessel van der Kolk's book and the message of the traumatologists. And that is this idea that the body keeps the score, that old repressed emotions are somehow stored in the body. So we have all these repressed memories or feelings in the body that are just looking to be released and looking to be purged. But again, if we look to the memory science doesn't know everything, right? But a lot of these mechanisms are well understood. What today's memory science points towards is that the body does not store memories, that memories are stored in the synapses of the brain, and that we need clusters of neurons to actually store memories. They're not stored in the body, right? Even implicit memory, which is movement motor patterns, are stored in the cerebellum, which is still in the brain. So skin cells or muscle cells do not store memory, according to the memory science. But when people are sold this idea that every pain, every rash, every ache, every itch, every nightmare, every discomfort is just some sort of signal that some repressed memory is about to get released, and they then begin to focus on that, and they get hypersensitive towards that, and they begin to dig for memories, dig for feelings, attach a lot of significance to that. This can create a lot of unnecessary psychological suffering. And what you never see pretty much with these meditation teachers, most of them, and awakening coaches, is any reference to, for example, metacognitive therapy. Now, if you look at today's psychological science and you look at what type of framework of the official ones seem to be the most effective for most people when it comes to what we call anxietizing and depressing, it's metacognitive therapy. Now, what are some of the key findings in metacognitive therapy? Well, it is that what we call depression and what we call anxiety are primarily overthinking problems. So, worry is anxiety's best friend, and rumination being depression's best friend. And what metacognitive therapists do is that they help people to become more aware of seeing thoughts as thoughts and helping them to reduce the volume of their thinking. It's the overthinking that leads to the despair and the sense of hopelessness and stuff like that. Way too seldom do you see meditation teachers and awakening coaches refer to any of this? And that is damn unfortunate. Also, they have a very outdated view on emotion. This old essentialist view of emotions, again, as something which is stored, in the body, or which is kind of innate and universal, and which is triggered by events. But if you look at modern research on emotion, take a look at the work of Lisa Feldman Barrett, in her book How Emotions Are Made, you'll see that the psychological science points in the direction of emotions being constructed and constructed on the spot and in the moment inside of us. They're not stored in the body. They're not repressed. They're not triggered. They're constructed in the moment. So is memory. We don't experience old memories. What we experience is what the mind thinks may have happened back then, but that's a thought construct being constructed in the moment. So it would be great if many of these teachers could read up a bit on modern memory science and psychological research instead of being stuck in these old essentialist views of emotions, these traumatologist activist positions of the body keeping the score, and these old psychodynamic concepts of repression, which there really is no basis for. Now, let me say this. There is a basis for suppression, as I said previously. And not that long ago, I heard this story, this woman called Amber Nicole Hayes, who talked about having repressed and that she developed these MS-like symptoms. And I got curious enough to buy her book because I'm always looking for counterexamples to my own thinking. Her book is called The Obedient Daughter. But it turns out that this wasn't repression, this was suppression. She had been raped by her brother at the age of 12. She'd never repressed the memory. She always knew that she had been raped by her brother at age 12. But she had done her best to not think about it and to distract herself from that fact. And when she got older, she had this period of life after she became a mother herself where this thought would come up all the time and she would kind of resist it. And she developed these MS-like symptoms. And of course, what really helped her was to acknowledge it and to feel it and to be willing to think it. And she confronted her brother and did all sorts of stuff, and her symptoms went away. This is well known from, for example, James Penbaker's research, what he called expressive writing, where he would have people take some conflict in their life or some traumatic experience, something, a secret, something that would bother them, and he would have them write about it for 15 to 20 minutes, 4 days in a row. And for somewhere between 70 and 80% of people, that had a dramatic positive effect that lasted for months. So of course, what can easily happen on the awakening path and when meditating is that when this whole chatterbox slows down a bit and we connect more with our feelings and experience, yes, we might be more available for thoughts and feelings. And if we don't have a good framework or know how to handle that well, then we can get in trouble. But that's a far cry from repression. So it's useful to make a solid distinction between suppression and repression on the other hand. Something else too, which is really important here, and that is that there's a saying that hypnosis, so my background, right, is in hypnosis. So there's a saying that hypnosis is a nightmare science because it tends to turn into what you suggest it to be. And one thing I see in the meditation world is people don't seem to have studied hypnosis and suggestion and memory and social psychology and stuff like that. They seem to be, again, stuck in these old trauma concepts and concepts of repression. So I'll give you an example of this. So, for example, when my daughter was born, the day after she was born, this nurse, I call her the Nurse Ratched in my 2015 book, Provocative Suggestions. She came into the room to speak to my wife and me, and she had this lecture that she would offer to all new mothers. And she started out with these kind of general pacing statements. This is a new situation for both of you, and it's your first child, and you probably have your questions and these general statements that it's very hard to disagree with. And then she would begin to look at my wife, and she would offer these very hardcore suggestions that about 80% of the new mothers had a breakdown in the hallway after a couple of days, and it was really important to just let that happen. And that she might just sit around and her mother-in-law might say something, and that she would fly into a rage and she would get depressed and anxious. And after a while, I stopped her and I started to sabotage it. So I would go, does everyone experience this? Or is this a mandatory response? And of course, Nurse Ratched got a bit irritated with me, and she had to admit that no, not everyone experiences this. No, it's not a mandatory response. So I did what I could to pick it apart. Now, later on, I had a chat with her where I addressed my concerns, and I said to her, do you tell all these mothers that 80% have a meltdown in the hallway? Oh, yes, I tell everyone. It's really important that they have that information. Now, what this particular nurse, who obviously has no background in hypnosis or social psychology or anything like that, she thought that she was just imparting information. Now, I don't know how many of the new mothers would have had those meltdowns in the hallways hadn't it been for that pep talk, but I'm sure it's not 80%. So what she's doing here is that she's offering suggestions. She's setting up a framework that increases the chance that when people internalize that framework, they will feel and experience and act in accordance with it. You see, these are mostly young mothers, new mothers. They're exhausted. They're confused. They might view this nurse as an expert. They're in a more suggestible place. So I think this happens a lot in the meditation community, where a lot of teachers offer these maps for the awakening path, where they work with a lot of confidence and certainty kind of impose that you're going to be having these dark nights of the soul, and again these repressed feelings coming up. And one thing that's very interesting, if you speak to various teachers who claim to have had awakenings or seen through the self illusion, is that most of them seem so certain, but they often operate from different frameworks. It's really clear that you don't have to have a dark night of the soul. There are many renowned teachers, people like Gary Weber and Byron Katie, for example, and Sydney Banks, who have not had these dark nights of the soul at all. Now, I'm not saying that some people won't have these experiences. I'm not saying to not talk about it or prepare people in responsible ways. But what I am urging is caution with imposing these frameworks that people very easily internalize, and which then increases the chances that people will feel and act in accordance with these frameworks. So a lot of people are suffering unnecessarily on the meditation path due to some teachers imposing these particular frameworks and then the student buying into them. I'll give you a very interesting counterexample. So there's this guy called Sydney Banks. He's dead now, but he had a couple of awakening realizations in the early 70s. He was not a meditator, but he had this profound moment of just seeing basically that it's all thoughts, essentially the principle of thought, and also having that realization that he was not a collection of thoughts, but what he essentially was the one mind that everything is an expression of. So he never had a dark night of the soul, and he formulated something which has been called the three principles. And I've met many people, teachers, and they seem on balance, to have good relationships and to be quite unneurotic, and many of his students have had profound insights, but none of them, as far as I can see, report any experiences with repression or horrible shadow elements coming forth, or dark nights of the soul, because it's not part of the teaching. It's not at all being promoted. Even if you're dealing with something where there's a good likelihood that something could happen. Let's say, for example, you're a medical doctor and you prescribe certain medications where certain side effects have a solid chance of appearing. You can still be honest about that, but you can present it using suggestions, using language, using framing in such a way that the person's less likely to manifest those side effects. And if they do, that they're utilized to foster hope and optimism and knowing that they're moving forward in a good direction. Couple of final things as well. Way too many meditation teachers are promoting the notion that deep insight into the self-illusion or the illusory nature of thought or impermanence, these sorts of things, that will necessarily result in someone behaving ethically. But there are quite a few people with solid narcissistic tendencies and even psychopathic tendencies who may have had profound meditative insights, but then those personality tendencies kind of hijack the insights, and they're used for nefarious means, right? So This notion that seeing that it's all one, essentially, that love is our nature, that this is necessarily going to produce more ethical behavior in the world. Well, consider, for example, a tiger. A tiger, for all that we know, doesn't have a lot of self-referential narratives or identities, but its nature is, at least from a human perspective, essentially being a predator, right? So there's too little discussion about these kind of cluster B personality tendencies amongst meditation teachers and on this particular path. Finally, another thing to look at, a lot of meditation teachers are not political, right? And that's a good thing. Some of them are, and I just noticed that so many of them seem to lean to the far left, essentially, politically. And they have every right to do so. But it's very often a very anti capitalism, anti West, anti individualism type orientation. And sometimes, especially with the trauma folks, you get a lot of that identity politics stuff going on. But here's something interesting to notice. The Western societies, while very far from perfect and very far from in alignment with anyone's sense of utopia, they are the only societies where you have something resembling rule of law and freedom of speech and universal human rights for everyone. It seems as if societies that orient rights around the individual is a prerequisite for evolving to a society which is culturally and systemically, that really acknowledges our basic interconnectedness, right? This does not seem to happen in societies, in Asia, or where Hinduism and Buddhism and stuff like that has been more prevalent. And as Brian Victoria showed, in his great book Zen at War, the notion of anatta or no self has been exploited and used in very nefarious ways with this combination of Japanese militarism and Zen teachers. So there is something about this bashing of Western culture and not acknowledging that, developmentally, in the same way that we seem to have to develop a selfing process and what looks like a stable sense of self before we can come to see its illusory nature. In the same way, culturally, to culturally and systemically evolve into a mode where our interconnectedness is deeply appreciated, we have to, it seems as if at least, we have to organize rights around the individual, right? So there's something about that as well. Anyways, I hope this little rant of mine has been useful. I'd love to hear your thoughts, whether you agree, disagree, partially agree. Please post your comments. If you're either struggling on the meditation path or you have some sort of change you want to make in your life and you're curious to know whether you and I could be a good fit. As I said, I've helped a lot of meditators who have been struggling. Oh, I wanted to say that too. In the meditation world, there are exceptions, people like Willoughby Britton and some others, but the marketing is pretty much for meditation to be a panacea of sorts, that it's always a good thing for all people in all contexts. But as Willoughby Britton's research shows, quite a few people have adverse experiences with meditation, and And meditation can be very destabilizing for many people. And if you don't have good support or good frameworks, you can land yourself into a lot of trouble. And for the most part, meditation teachers seem more or less completely unwilling to honestly address this. So that's also something that we in this community had better begin to look at honestly. Again, as I was said, if you're looking to see if you and I could be a good fit, you can reach me through email at provocative hypnosis.com. As always, thanks for listening.